Welcome to No Destination. I'm Dylan Kight, a songwriter trying to make sense of the stories I tell, the roads we take. Each week I break down a song, a story, a strange idea that's been following me around. Thanks for being here, friends. Today we're going to talk about High and Lonesome, another song off of my record, Late Bloomer in a Wallflower Suit. High and Lonesome came to me in a unique way. It was after dinner one night, and I just had this thing stuck in my head. We were high and lonesome. Ah, da, 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 da. We were high and lonesome. And I was like, wow, I think I might have something. Got the notebook, got the guitar, and started fleshing it out. This song started with the chorus. That is not typical, but it's how the song found me. It became clear that I started from the biggest point. I started with kind of the statement. And I didn't really know where to go from there. And the first thing that came to me was an experience that I had in my life as a younger person. And I've written about my dad in many ways. There's a song on my EP, Places in Between, called Grace, before he passed away, where I was trying to reconcile with the man he was, the dad he wasn't. It's heavy-handed, though. It's a younger Dylan trying to figure some very specific things out. And as a songwriter, the hope is that you leave enough space for people to find their own truth, their own way in to the story, and can see themselves in it, is my hope. And so as I had this chorus that I found very quickly in my lap, now became the work of writing the song. And that feeling reminded me of this specific moment of when I was younger. And while I've written about my dad in a lot of first-person context, there's only so much that I can say about my personal experience. And so for me, the way into this song was to try to tell the story from someone else's perspective. And in this instance, it's my sister. And I'm not going to divulge all the details because that's not important. I think the song stands on its own. But it was easier for me to write a song for her about that situation and the feeling that I had, that I could imagine that maybe she had in that moment. My father was a flawed man, and it's important to say that. But he's also not here. He's not here to tell his side of it, and maybe that's not what this is about, but that's why I'm not going to divulge too much. Families have their own stuff. But essentially, the version that I feel comfortable telling is that my sister and I, we come from my father's first and second marriage. We have different moms, and we didn't grow up in the same city. I grew up in Atlanta. She grew up in Statesboro. And so the times that I would actually get to see my sister were very few, far between, until we became adults, and then we became a lot closer. Very few people in this world understand what that experience was like growing up with him as a father than my sister, and vice versa. And this trip was one I think that my dad had great intentions for. We had never taken a family vacation. My mom and dad had separated when I was very young. I was still a baby. Was very young as well. So there, in my opinion, there wasn't a lot of idyllic years where there was the nuclear family. Great job, Pops, of making something happen. But he had this idea that we were going to take this family vacation. And this is before the, cell phones really were widely used by everybody. This is before social media. And so he picked me up. We went down to South Georgia, and he told me that we were going to go pick my sister up. And we were going to go to the beach. Now, I was a kid. The beach sounded great. Let's go to the beach. And all I knew in that moment is that we were going to go have fun. And there's something there, right? We picked up my sister, and we headed to Tybee Island. What I didn't know at the time that I know now is that he had neglected to tell either of our mothers that we were going on a vacation. It was his time with us, so that part wasn't nefarious or anything. But he hadn't disclosed that he planned on taking us somewhere. And my dad just wasn't the type of guy. He wasn't super responsible. He's not the kind of guy that, you entrust to take your children somewhere other than where he said he was going to. I know now that my mom was calling my grandmother, the police department, and all these crazy things to try to figure out where I was. And so we get to the motel, and it's one of those where you drive up right to the hotel room. It's shaped like a U. In my mind, it's on the main drag at Tybee. There's a pool in the middle. One of those things where you kind of keep the door open. Everyone's kind of going out, going to the pool, walking back, going to the beach. My sister and I got the idea to call our moms. And this is my memory, so it could be out of order, but I have this memory of us calling our moms, and they were very surprised that we were at the beach. And we went back the next day, needless to say. We were ordered to come home ASAP. And some other things were happening. And I can't remember if it was this specific frame of moment in time, but the OJ Bronco chase was everywhere. And as a kid, it dominated everything. And so it was on the news. It's all anybody was talking about. And so there's a verse about OJ, oddly enough, in the song. Nordberg is that character he played where he fell down the stairs in the wheelchair. And if you dig in, that's kind of what that's about. It may not seem super connected, but in my mind, that event was happening very much at the same time. For whatever reason, stuck out. So it could have been that day. It could have been that week. It could have been that month. I'm not really sure. I haven't gone back and checked, mainly because I don't know when I was actually at the beach, because I wasn't supposed to be at the beach. But we had to drop my sister off in Statesboro. I went to bed, and we were all sharing the same hotel room, and she ran away that night. Now, her mom, she had somebody pick her up, and my dad made it seem like she didn't want to be with us anymore. And so I was very confused. But again, I was a kid. I didn't really know where to place it. I didn't know what it meant. And it all ended the next day when I got taken home. But, this is a moment where, as my sister and I became closer and closer to one another, this event really stood out because, in my mind, it shows all of my dad's flaws. He had the best of intentions, but he wasn't a great communicator. I think he wanted something that he wasn't able to deliver on. And so it ended up in a much messier place than it would have been if he'd have just told everybody what he wanted to do. And I think his heart was in the right place. And I've gone through many seasons regarding my dad. And that changes over time. And then you become a dad, and it changes again. But as my sister and I have grown much closer as adults, as we've grown older, part of that bond was that we shared him as a father. And this is just one of those moments that stuck out. And so I think the song stands up without this very specific core memory. And I think people can draw whatever they want from it, I hope. It's a ton of fun to play live. It's great to see, when people stream it or buy the record and call out that song as, being one they really like. But it is for me one of those moments that I share with somebody very dear to me. And I think it's important to understand that as a part of my story, right? I mean, my dad was a flawed person, and why I took a break from music is probably explained in part because of who my dad was. So I'm going to butcher this, but I'm going to try. I'm pretty sure it was Obama who said that as men, you're trying to live up to the man that your father was, or you're trying to be the man he wasn't. Something to that effect. The sentiment of that quote always stuck with me. Because in my case, I was definitely trying to be the man he wasn't. Trying to be the dad he wasn't, the partner he wasn't. And that isn't really equal living the life that you choose, right? You're doing things, you're living a certain way because of a person. And that is not living for yourself, really. In the moment, it maybe is, in a way. But my dad died in 2011, somewhat unexpectedly. He was an addict, he was an alcoholic. He'd been that way for a long time. He'd gotten worse over a period of time. Last 10, 12 years had kind of been a pretty persistent downhill. I want to be as respectful as I can, but it was obvious that he was wrestling with his demons. And, when my son was born, it changed my relationship with my dad, because to take it back even one step further, I hadn't seen my dad since I was 15 years old. Now, you may ask, why haven't you seen your dad since you're 15? You seem like a nice guy. And the truth is because I couldn't love him and his demons. I needed space. And so I made the choice after I turned 15, because I think I saw him, the last time I saw him in person was the day before I turned 15. And that really embarked that informed a lot of who I was going to be. I was very determined to be the kind of person that he wasn't. That was my driving force. That's what lit my fire, whether it was professionally, creatively. He was a poet. He was a very good poet. But when he passed, well, let me back up. When my son was born, how it changed my relationship with him is because I had developed calluses. I had developed, this was like 10, 11 years later. And from the last time I saw him to when my son was born. And for me, how it changed is I had compartmentalized him in a certain part of my life, that he was there for this specific amount of time, and then he wasn't a part of my life anymore. And I really didn't deal with it, which, by the way, it shows up later if you choose to go to something like therapy, which I totally encourage. But when my son was born, it felt very personal all over again, because you look at your child, and listen, if you're a dog dad or a cat mom, you get a lot of the way there, I'm sure. But you look at this thing. For me, it was my son, and I couldn't imagine, and all of my being, how a father couldn't look at his daughter or his son and think, wow, whatever is going on, I need to change. And what I needed to change is, when Miles was born, my son, I had to reprioritize. I had to really focus on my career. I was doing a lot of music at the time, playing a lot of shows, working at a studio, because I didn't want to be a failure as a dad. And that weighed very heavy on me. And I didn't want my son to ever have to worry about that. And so when he was born, I played some shows, about 2 or 3 shows a year for about 2 years after he was born. And then I took a hiatus for almost 6 years without playing music. And it was that galvanizing of a moment when my son was born, because I was like, I can't let him down. Again, I was trying to be the person that my dad wasn't. So I was determined to be completely different than him. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I was living my life the way that I wanted to. And so fast forward a year and a half, my dad passed away, somewhat unexpectedly, but he'd been on this trajectory down for a while. And so it wasn't completely unexpected. And I got the phone call. Well, I got a Facebook message that he had gone to the hospital, and within a day or something, he was gone. It just went from really bad to worse. And I was in California at the time. And for the last year and a half, I had just been super tough, right? I'm a dad now. And when he passed, it was very difficult. Because in that moment, I realized that what I'd been hiding and keeping out was the love that I had for my dad, the relationship that I wanted with him. And all that came crashing down when I heard that when he had passed. And I did what I'd always done in moments where I couldn't verbalize things. I just started writing. And I did post this to social media because when you're hurt and you lose a parent, when you go through any kind of trauma, I think there's this part of it where maybe decorum or whatever you're holding in just kind of goes out the window, and you're okay for, I think maybe the reality of the situation is just that, like, why would I fake this? Like, it's not even a thing. So I posted this very open, I posted basically a journal entry to my social media at the time. I'm going to read that now. And I haven't shared that in a long time. But I think it's important to the High and Lonesome story to kind of understand maybe my perspective that led up to that. So this is what I wrote the morning that I found out. My dad was a complicated man. He was brilliant, lost, a terrible father, the world's greatest rock and roll fan, abusive to women, could light up a room, an addict. He could be disarmingly sweet, a coward, and he was an amazing writer. He was painfully human. He would not want me to tell you any different. In a lot of ways, I never knew my dad. I heard stories from his friends or relatives about who he was before he went to jail. I haven't spoken to him in years, and I haven't seen him since a couple days before I turned 15. I wasn't strong enough to love him and deal with his demons. I know now he isn't hurting. He's no longer running from his demons. They may have chased him to his grave, but his fight is done. I never thought I'd be sad or hurt. I'd built up walls so high and so dense, I really didn't know how I felt about my father. I always knew it would end like this. I just thought we would have reconciled before it happened. I thought we would have had peace. I thought we would have forgiven each other. That day never came. Death is the great equalizer. From the time I found out he was sick until he passed, it was only 2 days. I haven't been able to think of any of his faults or the bad things he did. Not because they didn't hurt, but because my love was simple. He was my dad. My walls no longer standing. The feelings I had hid were my good memories and my love. The things I couldn't have for me to be able to move on without him. The walls fell, and it was like I was looking at myself as a child, standing, waiting for him. That's the hardest part. What I had been hiding was the fact I loved him very much. My love for him is simple. Our relationship never was. In time, I will have to forgive him. Not for him, but for me. He didn't deserve that forgiveness, but I did. I am his son, but his demons were his own. So were his faults. I just wish I could have told him that when he was alive. That I loved him. That I loved him in spite of himself. Just a little light reading on this podcast, folks. We're 2 episodes in. We're getting to the deep stuff. But I do think it's important. Excuse me. I do think it's important to get this peek behind the curtain, because this was around the time that I stopped doing music. Around that same time, I was also going through divorce. In fact, that event, my first marriage dissolving and my dad dying, happened in the same week. And they'll never be able to be uncoupled. They happened at the same time. I'll never be able to tell which hurt was driving what emotion, but this wiped everything out. My dad passing away. And so now, here I was, a single dad, and my dad no longer with us. And in the reality and the perspective of who my dad was and who he wasn't, and who I felt I needed to be for my son. It was the first week of August, I believe. I took a red-eye flight from California to Atlanta. Everything was completely different. It was like I was in a Cameron Crowe movie. I was listening to the first Bon Iver record on repeat. I was sad, but I was more stunned. I was not confused. I was bewildered. And I went to his funeral. And I hadn't been to his hometown since I was a kid. And I saw relatives that I hadn't seen in a really long time. And the last thing I'll tell you about that is, well, there's two things. There's one that's funny, one that's not so funny. So the funny part, it's not really funny. It's just, when you got a face like this, folks, you got to get your kicks, right? So my sister and I we're down there together, and we're at the viewing. Everybody clears out so we could be alone, and we're crying. It's terrible, right? It's just one of those moments you're a kid, and there's that realization that even though our grandparents were still alive, there's now no longer a generation between you and the great unknown. So anyways, we're sitting there, we're crying, and I think she, we started making comments, it was the viewing, so you start making comments like, well, he doesn't really look like him, or we had never seen him in a suit before. My dad was always in jeans and a t-shirt, and now he was in a suit. And I think we just talked about how weird that was, because if you've ever been through that experience, it's tough. There's nothing like that. It's just so foreign of a feeling. And I think I touched his hand and saying my goodbyes, and she was going to do that, and I knocked her arm, and she started laughing because she touched him and she didn't want to touch him, and we started going back and forth and just cutting up, and people must have thought we were insane because we were sobbing, and then we'd start busting out laughing because we'd make some joke about the way his face looked or about something that he would say if he could say something right now, and then we'd start crying again. I'm sure the people who worked there thought we were insane, and I felt insane at the time. The next day we go to his funeral, and it's a hot August day in South Georgia, unbearably. One of those days in the South where the sun feels somehow closer to the surface of the earth than the rest of the year. And I wore jeans and a t-shirt because I thought that's what he would have wanted. So I was more comfortable than most. But my dad was a complicated guy. He was very smart, very intelligent. He was a wonderful writer, but he was an atheist, and he had no problem. He loved theology. He loved talking about religion. He loved to read about religion. And at this church, which was, I think, like a Southern Baptist church, the preacher started trying to convert people, it happens in some denominations. Some denominations are different than others, and faiths are different. Some faiths use that as a moment to pull people in to the tent, I guess, so to speak. And I was very not okay with that, because I knew that that's something that he wouldn't have wanted. He wouldn't have wanted to be a bartering chip for someone's eternity. That's not something he would have, I think, wanted. I think. And so that made me angry. And then the preacher said something to the effect, well, I knew him really well. And then he said my father's name, and he said our last name, and he said it wrong. And people say my last name wrong all the time. I feel bad for my son and my wife because, they didn't deserve that. But what you get with this last name is everyone adds an N, so everyone calls you Knight, which is fine because Knight is way more commonplace, and so I never begrudge someone if they mistake it or whatever. But he said Knight twice, like Robert Knight, and I was just like, F this, and I just got up and walked out. And I think for me, the last time I saw him, in a way I stood up to him, in my opinion. And the last time I was with him at his funeral, I in a way, I feel like I stood up for him because that's not what I think he would have wanted. And then that joker was saying his name wrong. It was just making me so mad. Anyway, I walked right out the middle of the church. I'm sure people thought, again, I was insane. I was just stunned that life was happening this fast. So I go outside. Again, it's hotter than hell. The service or the ceremony or whatever didn't last much longer. My sister's friend followed me out there, my boo, Jet, who I greatly appreciate. But the preacher came out and he tried to tell me he was going to pray for me. And I had to be ushered away into other conversations because I was so frustrated with that. It's important to tell you the positive things about my dad too, because again, he's not here to tell you different. And I don't think, despite his flaws, that he would have wanted me to tell you much different. But my dad was a very empathetic person. My dad was a very charismatic person. My dad would buy records with no money to his name. It was so, what's ingrained in my head is that he would cash his checks at the record store in Little 5 Points. And that's the money that we would live on for the weekend. We'd go to Tortillas or the Braves game. And part of the reason why I'm such a big Braves fan, besides I just loved them when I was a kid, but it's also something my dad would also take me to. We would wait until the 4th or 5th inning, and I'd have to wake him up because he'd be zonked out. But at a certain point, and I can't remember when it was at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, but at a certain point in the game, they would open up the turnstiles. And so we would basically sneak into the stadium when I was with him every so often during the summer. And that was my chance to just be a kid and just to forget kind of all the realities. And so I would get so excited all day waiting for the mail to come, hoping that somebody had mailed him a check, and we could go to the Wax and Facts and cash the check and then go to the Braves game or Tortillas. And even then I was very sensitive that I felt like my dad was trying with the best that he could, for sure. And in a lot of ways, his never-ending quest to find out everybody that played on a record, or all the session musicians, who did the cover art, all the side projects they were involved with. He would show up at a venue with just stacks of records of all these things that people had been involved with. And from what I hear, the musicians would be blown away because this is before people knew all these things, and there was the internet, and you had to go to the record store, you had to talk to people, you had to really study all these things these guys had been on. And that informed my love for music, not just at a surface level, but to really understand all the things that went into it, because he had this kind of ability to be so appreciative of all of it, the music. My dad used to say, I'm the world's greatest rock and roll air guitar player. And he meant it. He didn't play an instrument, but he loved rock and roll. He would drive this two-door Dodge truck. Speakers were busted all to hell because he would listen to the radio way too loud. And he'd play organ on the dashboard. He loved music. And being so young, seeing someone love something so much, it was something that we both did in a way that probably informed things. So there was grace on Places in Between, where I talk about my experience. And I think that's a song from my perspective. The song on Late Bloomer in a Wallflower Suit, High and Lonesome, is a song I wrote for my sister, like from her perspective, about a shared event, because it was easier to talk about. And I didn't walk you through all these things to make you feel sorry. I'm very grateful of who my parents were. I'm grateful for the experiences I had. I'm grateful that I was able to share that with my sister. But I do think it informs why I stepped away from music, because I didn't want to be that person. And I think it informs how I think it informs how I think it informs the person I became. And when I was a younger person, I was trying to be the opposite of him. And I ran into somebody, I can't remember, somebody I used to work with, who used to go to a lot of my shows. And he had made some comment about, are you in a band? Are you putting out music? And I was like, no, man, I retired from music. I don't do that anymore. And he's like, really? I was like, really? Yeah. Can you believe it? And he goes, well, does your son, do you play music around your son? And I was like, no, not really. And he was like, that was like a big part of who you were. And he was right. It is a big part of who I am. And I started to play a whole lot more guitar after that. It was like some subliminal permission statement wrapped up in a question to me that I kind of internalized. Like, yeah, I can have a healthy relationship with music, because I had done it really seriously before. And it started out innocently, where I'd sit in and play guitar in a jam session, or that quickly became I'll play guitar in someone else's band, fill in for some live shows, to I'm going to help somebody write songs for their record. And then that became Brilliant Mistakes. And so in episode 1, we talked about Worst of Me, and that being kind of like a letter to that band that fell apart, and how Brilliant Mistakes really became Late Bloomer in a Wallflower Suit that you hear. And that's how I got there musically. High and Lonesome is a story that is very personal, but informative to my gap in job history as a musician. I had to go live through that grief, process that, be a person, be a parent, be a friend, go to some concerts as a fan where there was nothing at stake except just having a good time. And I fell in love with it all over again, in a way where I am so much more appreciative of what music does for me and allows me to do, that I think it was worth sharing. It was worth sharing that kind of story, how it extends the timeline. And that's why I took 5 or 6 years away from music. I was going through life stuff, and I just had to process that, and I had to go be a person. And I've learned that I could be a lot of things that have nothing to do with my dad. And the messed up thing is, the longer you live, it's like, man, I wish he could have seen this. He would have loved Late Bloomer in a Wallflower Suit. I think he would have so appreciated that song, and he would have gotten a kick out of the fact that I wrote a song for my sister and that it sounded good. And listen, all the episodes aren't going to be this heavy. But what's the point of having a direct conversation if we can't talk freely? You're not arriving at this because I whip a nay-nay, or because I write songs that you find on playlists most of the time. I write songs of my lived experiences and stories that I think need to be told. And this is one of those that was worth going deeper on. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate the ability to have this kind of conversation. Until next time.